Exodus 001. Before I begin with the book of Exodus, I need to tell you, the book of Exodus and the book of Deuteronomy are parallel books, in that some of the history of Israel is spoken in one book, and some of the same history is in the other. Exodus is written in the format of telling of events that happened, a history lesson, so to speak, whereas Deuteronomy is a letter that Moses wrote to the next generation of Israelites that were in the wilderness at Mount Sinai that are getting ready to cross over the Jordan River to the Promised Land. You see, God having more serious issues with the Israelites, so much that he actually has them stall at Mount Sinai for a year. For one reason, just to clear out a generation that God did not want in the Promised Land. This took an average of 75 funerals a day. Sounds morbid, but true. There are 2.5 million Hebrews at that time. There was even a point when they start to leave the area that God told Moses that God couldn't go with them because God still wanted them annihilated. Another point, for the fun of it, is if I see a point that needs to be made, I will stop what I'm talking about and say, squirrel. There are facts about sections of Exodus that don't seem clear due to not being written in a context that even I was able to understand. But to look through the book of Deuteronomy clarifies what was said. When this takes place, I will tell you whether the information came from Exodus or Deuteronomy, so you can look them up. Squirrel. Change of subject to prepare you for oncoming events. Let's talk a minute about the difference between a contract and a covenant. There are different contracts and different covenants. A contract is more or less something on paper. Buying a house with a payment schedule and issues is a contract. A contract is on paper where people sign it, and without that signature, nothing is binding. A covenant is a formal, solemn, and binding agreement. No paperwork necessary. There is the parity covenant and the suzerain covenant. A marriage is a parity covenant. That is person to person. A parity covenant can be man to man, company to company, or even country to country. It is still a parity covenant. The suzerain covenant is between a greater and a lesser, like a king and their subjects. Moses and God had a suzerain covenant. God, the greater, to Moses, the lesser. God is giving the Canaanite land to the Israelites because although God owns everything in the first place, men put deeds on things as if he owned them. God bypasses deeds with his covenant to the Israelites, starting with Abraham, in that God was giving them the land of Canaan, which is a suzerain covenant. Nothing can stop it. You will find all battles the Israelites won were selected by God because God was making the Israelites the automatic winners, most often by sending an angel and scaring the inhabitants off the land. In biblical times, a covenant was what was offered more often. Back to Exodus. Exodus was a book of the events that took place in this era. An era is a time section that deals with the events, such as the pioneer era. The book of Deuteronomy is a letter written from Moses to the Hebrews about this same era. Moses tells the new children, or the next generation that is still out in the wilderness, who are about to take the promised land, what their parents, which are no longer around, had done that God was extremely upset with the previous generation. but that God could not violate the covenant he made with Abraham, and God therefore shifted this covenant to you, their offspring. The land flowing with milk and honey that was promised to them shall be moved to you, because they were an extremely stiff-necked people and had a very hard time believing in God, because the only thing they could see was their rearview mirror. And therefore the covenant land that God gave to them after getting them out of Egypt will now go to their offspring. Exodus starts out as a story of Moses getting them out of Egypt and ends up being a story of Joshua leading them to the promised land. For this reason, there will be times when I will quote Exodus, and other times I will quote Deuteronomy, and will state so at that moment. I will also recommend in Deuteronomy that when you get to this area to read about it, and where in the book of Exodus, not to avoid rewriting the same story, but to get you to see the Bible is more than one book. One story, but instead multiple books with more details of the same story, much like you would get at a crime scene. Each person will give you a different version of what happened, and it's up to you to put the pieces together. I have done it for you, so you can concentrate on just listening and learning. It is obvious the book of Exodus is about exiting. In Genesis, we covered from the beginning of everything to Joseph becoming prime minister of Egypt directly under Pharaoh himself. Joseph moves his family to the land of Goshen, which is the best land Egypt has to offer. This will become problematic because as the 12 tribes multiply in population, they steadily get a bigger population than Egypt. We begin the book through the family tree to let you know the family had grown in Goshen. Jacob and siblings and their families, 70 in all. The first part of this era is a blessing from Joseph and Pharaoh. The land of Goshen was the best Egyptian land. Well, Joseph eventually dies, and so does the Pharaoh of the time. Remember, Pharaoh of the time was because Pharaoh is just a title, not a name, like president or mayor. The passing of the time shows how much Israel's population has become. The blessing of the land of Goshen soon becomes very crowded. The new Pharaoh is starting to see the Israelites grow big time. Egypt cannot allow Israel to grow so much. Should a war break out, Egypt would lose strictly by numbers. Let's put this in perspective. A big city has a small town that is literally across the street and expanding in the opposite direction so as keep their small town identity and not to take over the city. It is still the small town, but by name, but getting bigger. Should this small town decide it wants to take over the big city purely by numbers in a battle, it could. The big city mayor sees this possibility and decides that because telling the little town's people that they, by proclamation, have to start working for the big city so that the big city can maintain control over them. I know that is a lot to chew, but that is what Egypt did. They turned their Egyptian slaves into foremen of the Hebrew slaves, and the Egyptian slaves were allowed to beat the Hebrew slaves and tell them they were scum. The incoming Pharaoh decides to put the Hebrews into slavery. Exodus 1:11. Much of Egypt was already in slavery because they had sold everything to the house of Egypt by selling themselves for food because a very severe famine in the land. Much like our president and Congress, the house of Egypt were the only ones not affected by the famine because they had all the seed for food due to Joseph. You see, Joseph gave the house of Egypt a way to survive the famine, and it was so successful that even after Joseph's death, Egypt kept up the practice. The Egyptian slaves were treated like management and were provided food and housing. The Hebrew slaves, on the other hand, were treated like actual slaves with beatings and disrespect in order that Egypt still had the upper hand. Being Hebrew was at the bottom of the barrel in society. A good bit of their time in Egypt was tyrannical slavery. They were referred to as Hebrew slaves, and because they were being demeaned, this goes on for 400 years. Yes, all this happens between Genesis and Exodus. Now that slavery abounds, the Pharaoh tells the midwives of the Hebrews that no Hebrew male is to live by throwing that male child in the Nile. This doesn't make sense to me because the males make better workers. Not to put any females down, we're just talking about strength. Pharaoh will kill all newborn males. He told them to let only the daughters live. The midwives had the fear of God in them and spared the lives of the sons. This is the first case of civil disobedience. Civil disobedience is when you don't do what the law of the land tells you to do. When the law of the land of man supersedes God, God still has his way. Shiphrah and Puah, the midwives of the Hebrews, tell Pharaoh that the Hebrew women have actually started giving birth before the midwives could get to them. Pharaoh decided to make this an edict and give the order throughout the land that this is what the people are to do. During all this 400 years, the Hebrews are praying to God to make all this stop. Next, along comes Moses. Please come back and we will go on an adventure.